is my most sincere pleasure to welcome you to our third Fulbright Forum presented by a 2011 program year grantee. Tonight, we are joined by junior researcher Danny Crichton as he presents his work entitled Steve Jobs, South Korea and the Search for Innovation. In his presentation, Danny will trace the global effort to pursue scientific and technological innovation using the success of Silicon Valley as a model. As of yet, many other states and nations have struggled to replicate these initiatives. Danny proposes to examine the question of why these similar efforts have failed and pose the question, what exactly are the regional resources unique to Silicon Valley? In Korea, it is well known that during the past half-century, technological innovation has been one of, if not the most important economic drivers for success and prosperity. Danny will trace the roots of this successful contributing factor to the miracle on the Han. I think Han means Han River. But also will note the lingering doubts about the future of South Korea's innovation infrastructure. He hopes to illustrate how innovation is based on the individual level and not inherently linked to institutions. Danny Crichton graduated from Stanford University in 2011 with a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mathematical and Computational computational science. With his Fulbright Junior Research Grant, Danny works to study the development of high-tech industry by investigating the intersection of higher education, urban development planning, and labor economics. His affiliation is at KAIST in Daejeon, in the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy. As the only junior researcher living outside of Seoul, we are so thrilled to have him with us this evening. Following tonight's presentation and a brief Q&A session, I hope that you will join us for a light reception on the third floor. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming 2011 Fulbright Junior Researcher, Danny Crichton.
Hello, is this working? How's that? Everyone can hear me? Thank you so much for showing up this evening. I thank God that the weather has kind of broken up and we aren't going to get between the two rainstorms this morning and tomorrow. Tonight I'm going to talk about innovation. And innovation is sort of a panacea you hear from a lot of policymakers, politicians, business leaders, etc. But I want to get really close to critically analyzing what the concept of innovation means. What do you think when you hear the word innovation? For me, I think of Hello Kitty camcorders, an innovative take on how do we record video. But a more futuristic example might be the recent news from last week of the new Google eyeglasses, sorry it's a little dark, in which you might actually be able to have augmented reality, to be able to look on Google Maps as you're walking around and seeing buildings. Thank you. And what's amazing about innovation is it has a very visceral reaction with us. Most of you are probably familiar with this person, Steve Jobs, a business leader. Not so different from maybe thousands of others of CEOs, but extremely famous. And when he died here in University Avenue, thousands of people posted post notes on the Apple Store on University Avenue. And that kind of visceral reaction is something that innovation is really kind of the only economic area of the economy that really produces that. If you were at COAX this morning for the new iPad 3 release, you would have seen hundreds of people lining up for a new device, weathering the storms and everything else. And so what produces that kind of reaction among people? What is it about technology and innovation? And finally, as the third part of this title, is Korea. I think there's no other country that combines the kind of traditional historical approach to culture with very much a modern core, especially here in Seoul. And I have tons of photos where you have this classic Hanok village with a high-rise apartment right in the background. And so those are the three topics I want to talk about today. I'm going to start with a topic about innovation, which is really getting into what does innovation mean? How do we define innovation? And this is actually extremely challenging, and there are dozens of different definitions. We're also going to talk about creativity and what an innovation hub really means. And then we're going to dive into the most famous example of this, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is the high-tech leader in the world, and there is no other region like it. And so trying to understand where it came from, what characteristics it has, what its qualities are, is extremely important if, as a policymaker, you want to build something similar. And finally, and hopefully the majority of this presentation will focus on South Korea, my experiences in research here. So let's dive right into innovation. What is innovation? You saw the glasses here before. I think most of us would agree that futuristic glasses that you can wear for augmented reality is a pretty good example of innovation. But it's a hardware. It's a piece of something you can hold. Innovation is also software. It's a smiling photo of Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook is an innovation. It's a new way of communicating with one another. But there's nothing hard about it. There's nothing you can touch. It's innovation of the mind. Another example of innovation are laws. Ways in how we govern ourselves. Ways in which we create a social structure. Another example of innovation comes from art, aesthetics. New ways of describing the world, projecting it to other people. And finally, there's even personal innovations, such as when I discovered that there was a new breakfast place in Seoul. They do have French toast and gangnam after all. And so I'm going to use a very simple and very wide-reaching definition of innovation. Innovation is value added. That's it. If it adds value, economic value, aesthetic value, social value, it is an innovation if it's done compared to the past. And that is an incredibly inspiring notion. When you think about innovation, we oftentimes hear about, there's not enough innovation in the world. But what's great about this is innovation is happening all the time. And this kind of leads into our notion of creativity. When you think creativity, I usually think this. A little toddler kind of in a room with paint splashed all over them, kind of chaotic, not really organized. But this isn't very useful in an economic sense. Businesses can't hire toddlers to come up with new ideas for them. Sad to say. And so what is creativity? The definition I'm going to use for creativity tonight is developing a solution using tools within constraints. What this means is, for instance, the baby is expressing himself. That's his solution to the problem of how he gets his message across, using paints within the constraints of his abilities, using motor controls. They have to close that window eventually. But it also includes things like businesses. How do you create a new iPad? You have to do it within the constraints of physics. You have to do it within the constraints of parts that Samsung can produce. And you have to use the tools of engineering to be able to do so. And combined, these two notions are very empowering. All of us are innovative. Perhaps at different levels, perhaps different values of innovation. But we all are innovative every single day. Even when you come up with a new route to your bus stop and save 3 minutes, you've created value for yourself. And so what I think one of my first messages here, and one I will kind of push a lot, is to stop search for innovation despite my title. Innovation is already around us. It's not a question of finding innovation. It's a question of making it more valuable, building it up, but we don't have to start from scratch. It already exists today. And finally, I want to talk about what an innovation hub is. That's kind of the topic, the subject I teach or research, are these so-called innovation hubs. We have to define sort of a different definition first. So most of us think of Silicon Valley. This is University Avenue. This is where Google started. This is where Facebook got large and a lot of other famous companies. This is the classic innovation hub. But there are other places in the world that are innovative. Hollywood, for instance, makes a lot of new movies, a lot of media, new content. It's very innovative in this field. If you go to Milan in Italy, you'll see some very innovative clothing, nothing I would probably wear. but certainly pushing the edge of what fashion means. And so these are economic clusters. They're places where industries have come together, they've agglomerated. There's multiple, Armani and other fashion houses in Milan. There are hundreds of startup companies in Silicon Valley. Hollywood has dozens of movie studios. But that is not what an innovation hub is. When we think of an innovation hub, when policymakers think of an innovation hub, they are meaning two adjectives, high tech and high growth, and particularly high growth. So when you hear about policymakers talk about economics, there's just a bit of a problem. When they say innovation hub, they really mean as economic clusters. They want areas that are high growth. They also want areas that are strong, economically competitive in a globalized economy. And so we have to be very cautious that, you can read the OECD report on South Korea's innovation. It focuses mostly on tech. There's a small note in about page 9 or 10 that says, well, maybe we should actually think about more things. And they're like, nah, that's going to be too much. So keep this in mind, because I'm going to focus on high tech for the rest of this lecture. But when we were actually considering an innovation economy, we want to have all the creative industries represented, everything from media and advertising to manufacturing to the kind of software that's done in Silicon Valley. It's a big pie, and we can't just focus on one small part. So with the kind of background definitions, we have the innovation as value added, creativity is using tools within constraints, and this kind of notion of an innovation hub where these industries have come together to kind of create a very high-pace industrial kind of competition in the globalized economy. We're going to dive right in to Silicon Valley. I think all of us, how many people are familiar with this place or have heard of it? Is this, making sure the audience, we're doing an audience check here. There's really nothing, there's no picture of Silicon Valley. It's flat, there's some mountains in the back, but in the actual place where people live, it's flat, a lot of trees. This is Stanford from the space I was, or not space, from the air, an airplane I was on. And I want to give some numbers real quick to get you a sense of the scale of this place. It's about 3 million people. And there are 1.3 million jobs, so a little less than half of the people who live in this region are employed. The average earnings per person is $86,000. It's one of the richest regions in the world. And before we kind of dive into the history of this place, I want to describe what it's like today. What is Silicon Valley? What are its unique properties? First, and I think most important, is it's diverse. No other place in the world has the level of diversity in ethnicity and foreign-born as Silicon Valley does. More than a third of the population comes from overseas. They are not born in the United States. Of those who are, about a third are white, a third are black, a third are Hispanic. I'm sorry, did I misread that? It's Asian, not black. Sorry. And other, which includes African American and Pacific Islander. In addition, it's educated. It's one of the most educated regions in the entire world. 43% of people who live in this region have a college degree. It's 3 million people. And you can see the numbers here. More than 25, a quarter of the people who live here have a master's degree or better. So we have this both diverse and educated region. Third, and an important component that's often overlooked when we talk about this is environment. What can we explore in the region around us? What is this kind of spatial characteristics of it? Silicon Valley is unique. It's huge. It's hundreds of miles, square miles. It has 3 metropolitan cities spread out: Oakland, San Francisco, and San Jose. And it's a fact that a lot of people don't know. San Jose is actually the largest of the 3, by far. San Jose at this time, I believe, is the 10th largest city in the United States. And San Francisco does come close. And so this unique kind of environment, spatial characteristics of the valley is very important. It's spread out, but along certain highways, certain areas. But what's probably most well known for, and probably not surprising, is its vibrant economy. It's the number of firms that are here in the valley. This is just the software firms that are kind of most famous, and this was only a couple of years ago. You can see names, a lot of which you might recognize: Google, Facebook, Adobe, Oracle, Netflix, PayPal, TiVo. And these are just some of the large ones, and there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these companies. And what's amazing about this fact is that of all the people employed in Silicon Valley, only 7% are in these industries. It's less than 1 in 10 are in the software industry. And so when we think about innovation hubs, there's a lot of factors we can consider. It's the people, it's the demographics, it's the spatial geography of where people are located in relation to each other. It's the environment, the natural resources that are around us, economic, corporate, firm structure, whether there are a bunch of small firms well networked or large firms that are vertically and horizontally consolidated and integrated. And it's a culture and society. And the big question that I explore is which of these actually matter? Which of these factors are necessary conditions to spark a regional hub? So, to answer that question, we have to ask, where did Silicon Valley come from? And there's a couple of problems with this, because it's really debated. There are about 12 to 14 theories pretty popular right now about where Silicon Valley came from. Now, thankfully, due to the lack of time, we aren't going to go over all 12 ideas tonight. We are going to go over 4 theories and my favorite bad idea, just to give you a flavor of what some people think are important characteristics. First and foremost, in terms of the history of Silicon Valley, the majority of scholars blame or kind of suggest that military funding was crucial to Silicon Valley. Starting in World War II, radar became one of the key technological advances of that war that allowed the Allies to defeat the Axis powers. And Silicon Valley was at the core of some of the major parts for radar dishes. And as Silicon Valley's industries developed, they developed the ability to apply for Pentagon grants. They got more funding, and this allowed them to kind of begin this process of constant evolution, of revolution throughout the 50s and 60s. And so this kind of leads us to this idea of lots of money is a solution to starting a region. You want to start innovation, dump a couple $2 billion on it over 20 years, and innovation will happen. And this is the majority. And if you look around the world, there are about 180 or so identified innovation hubs that governments are putting in place. Some famous ones are in London, in Russia, outside of Moscow. The problem is, they don't often work. And one of the problems with this theory that I really push is that Silicon Valley was not actually a major source, or a major destination of military funding. Boston was. MIT and the Route 128 got far more on a per capita basis than Silicon Valley. So if it's just lots of money as a solution, it doesn't make sense that Silicon Valley exists in California and not in Boston. So that leads us to go to some other kind of theories. So next, is it organizational? So it's not just maybe the money, but how firms organize related to each other. Maybe they're really networked and they're really small. This is research that came out of the early 1990s. And what Emily Saxenian had showed is Silicon Valley is built off of a model where people don't do multiple things. They're not Samsung, so to speak. They focus on one tiny part, and they sell that to other companies. And when we make a product, all these little companies get linked together. And so there's this kind of bleeding over. There's this innovation that kind of spreads out through the network. Because you have to tell these companies what you're doing in order for them to build something for you. And as that kind of innovation spreads quickly, it creates a kind of rapid turnover in firms that you see in Silicon Valley. The solution here to create kind of an innovation hub would be to break up large firms, to encourage these kind of 20 to 50 to 100 person startup companies, and avoid those 100,000 person behemoths that were famous in the Route 128 case. There's some value here, I think, and we'll discuss a little bit about this in the Korean context where there are very large firms. So we'll come back to that a little later. One of the popular theories I think a lot of us will accept is education. As I mentioned before, Silicon Valley is one of the most educated regions in the entire world. Stanford is obviously at the heart of Silicon Valley. It's not just the students, but also the research that takes place here. Stanford was a pioneer in industry, government, and university industry government relations. It allowed professors to leave their post, to join companies, to come back to their tenured positions. It created the Stanford Industrial Park that allowed the first companies to exist on Stanford's campus, to do their research near the faculty. And so it created these kind of first links. And this is the most effort that all policymakers take, right here, is how to create these industry-university partnerships. If you read the OECD report, and no one should because it's really boring, but if you read the 200, 300 pages of the OECD report, you will find that about 70% of it is devoted to the question of how do we create industry-university partnerships. And so the solution is pretty simple. Build world-class universities, get faculty involved with industry, and the rest should sort of follow. I think it's a little bit of a clean solution, but it's not untrue. It's correct in saying that high-quality faculty and high-quality researchers working together does lead to sort of innovation. The last theory, so we've talked about 3 so far. The last theory is culture. This is one of my favorite photos from Google. This is the slide you can take from the 3rd to the 1st floor. There are many of these throughout the Googleplex. So if you ever have to go to a meeting and you don't want to take the stairs, you can just kind of slide in and make it work. You can also see one of the free dining halls in the background. And this kind of fun culture really permeates everything that happens in Silicon Valley. It's quite interesting. Creating a culture of openness. Google actively encourages its employees to leave Google and create companies. And that is not just Google. Companies throughout Silicon Valley take this very progressive, open approach to competition because they know that they can buy these companies back out later on. And they also understand a very famous book by Clayton Christensen called The Innovator's Dilemma, which is that companies are often not good at working on technologies that disrupt themselves. They can't work on technologies that, for instance, if a new search engine were to come up, Google is probably not where it's going to come from. It's probably going to come from outside of Google, from new people who are not within the kind of bubble, who have a new idea, a new approach. And so all these companies really realize that. You may have noticed, if you read the news, that Facebook just bought out Instagram last week for $1 billion. And it's kind of crazy. There's only 13 people working at the firm right now. But when you realize that for Facebook, the value is seeing this new innovation on how to share photos, which is a core function of Facebook, that the ability to just have them go out, come back, and kind of continue working on the product is really at the core of what they do. So how do you change culture? That's pretty tricky. I think changing culture is not a very easy or recommended approach for government. And I know the Korean government, we might talk a little bit about, it's really emphasized trying to change the culture of firms here like Samsung to really work with other cable and other corporations. And I just don't think that that's going to be too successful. But I want to end, this is one of my favorites. This is a tenured professor. I want to end on one bad idea. A tenured professor, whose name I won't mention because I feel it's bad, says, this is her theory. She says, innovation is about red roofs. Right there. Because most of the innovation that happens in Silicon Valley happens in buildings with red roofs. And I think this actually may work in the Korean case because, as you know, we have blue roofs here. Part of the reason we may not have innovation is just maybe roof color. So maybe if we just let's not repaint paint the roofs red, and I think we'll avoid any problems. So there are so many theories here. We just mentioned 4 theories. There's another 8 or so, and dozens more if you just let people brainstorm. But I think the best one came from the kind of chair of one of the regional government bodies of Silicon Valley. He says it's an accident of history. And what he meant was, no policymaker anywhere made the decision that Silicon Valley was going to be innovative. And that's why it's Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is as far away from Washington, D.C. of any major city besides Seattle. And it's this distance from government, from controllers, from policies. It's libertarian ethics, ethos. It's kind of countercultural. If any of you read the Steve Jobs biography or are familiar a little bit with the countercultural movement and how it influenced computers, but this was a huge movement. And I think this really gets at what happened here. It was a sequence of improbable events all coming together. And so it's difficult to just duplicate what you see. It's important to start with what you have. But the last thing I want to talk about with Silicon Valley, what exactly is it? What is it an innovation hub of? And I think today most of us would say internet, or computers, but that isn't its history. it started off in place run tubes, moved to the integrated circuit, moved to semiconductors, moved to the personal computer, moved to the internet, moved to social networks. It's moving to solar and biotech and clean tech today. So what is it exactly? It is a high growth region. This region specializes in firms that grow fast. That's what it does. And so don't think of it as a so quote-unquote technology region, although that's what it focuses on. It is high growth. It focuses on industries that are growing 20, 50, 100% a year. And that's what it's designed to do, from venture capital to the lawyers who work here to the accountants. It's designed to work for firms that are growing fast. And most of the cycles for all the industries I just mentioned were about 10 to 15 years. And if you know, the internet was open for commercial transactions in '95. And so we're hitting just over the 15-year period, which is why you're starting to see kind of the clean tech, solar tech movement as the growth rate slows in some industry and some internet businesses. So with that, we're going to have a background in history, some of the characteristics of Silicon Valley. I want to dive in for the majority of the time here on South Korea, since that's why we're here. South Korea, as I mentioned, is not only just a traditional and modern place, it's fast moving. I visited Sejong City. It's a little dark again, sorry. This is a city that didn't exist, and in fact, if you look, this part of it doesn't exist. It hasn't been built yet, but this half has. And when you walk around, it's crazy. There's no one really living here yet, although there's some people who've moved into some parts of it. But when you look out, I was on a 10th floor observation post in the middle of what looked like a field. And when you look out, literally, there's this part of the city, and they're just open, blank, like space. Kind of like Sim City, if you've ever played the game, and you want to just build your little fire stations. And it's crazy. It's literally a zone. It's all about zoning, you know, industry next to commercial. This is the future city of Korea, much like Songdo out here in Incheon. And it's a speed at which we can just kind of build it. It just happens. It's really unique, I think, to Korea and somewhat to East Asia and China. But it's something at the core of innovation, is moving fast. And so when people say, and you might hear this often, that Korea doesn't have innovation potential, it doesn't have innovation talent, I really beg to disagree, because it moves fast. And that's at the core of innovation. But I want to start with some numbers. Many of you probably have a general sense of this, so I'm just going to quickly, it's about 50 million people in South Korea today. It has about, again, half of the population is employed, 25 million employees. The GDP just cracked $1 trillion 2 years ago, and the average per capita GDP is about 21,000. And what I think is more interesting, though, is this quote from Hugh Mason. In 2001, the 300 teams that applied to the JFDI Innovate 2012 boot camp, none were from Korea. And this boot camp is kind of the premier startup accelerator here in Asia. And there were 300 from across every country in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and none were from Korea. And so tonight I'm hoping to explain sort of why that is and what can be done to kind of solve that problem. So on the agenda for South Korea, we have 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about education, mostly higher education, and mostly my research at KAIST, because that's where I'm based as the only researcher outside of Seoul. We're also going to talk about the ecosystem. How can we start companies here in Korea? And finally, a little bit of just policy and conclusions. So talking about higher education in KAIST. You can see the commencement poster here. This is the front of KAIST. This week, if you were in Daejeon, you would have seen these beautiful cherry blossom trees. KAIST is actually well known for cherry blossoms. The same day that they were taking video of the cherry blossoms for broadcast, there was a student death. A student committed suicide by jumping off a 15-story building. So unfortunately, there's a lot of attention moved away from the Japanese cherry blossoms, and all the camera people went to the apartment building. But I want to start at first on quality. What is the quality of higher education here in Korea? This is a really crude way of doing it. This is the Times Higher Education rankings from this year. This is the number of universities in the top 200. On the right, you can see the United States has 75 of the top 200 universities. And the United Kingdom is right behind, so to speak, 37 universities. Korea has 3, Seoul National, Post-Tech, and KAIST. And it's interesting, if you look at some of the other industrialized countries, Netherlands, Norway, France, that have, say, a dozen top universities, there's something a little bit missing about the Korean higher education system. Another way of looking at this, which I think is a much better way, is looking at what actual students do. And last year, 73,000 South Korean students studied in American universities. This is the third highest in the entire world in terms of any of the other countries. China, which produces the most, is 218,000. So it's a little more than a third, a little less than a half. And China is a country with about 25 times the number of people. And so why is this? Why are South Korean students increasing number of South Korean students going to the United States, going overseas? This is just to the United States, and many of them go to UK and other universities. Why are they doing this? And on the big picture level, one of the issues with higher education here in Korea is centralized control. Universities have very little control here compared to American universities. They cannot decide how many students to admit. They cannot decide what criteria they're allowed to admit under. They're not allowed to decide tuition in many cases. They're not allowed to decide how many faculty in many cases. Most of the policies that are at universities are also decided by MEST, the Ministry of Education, Science, and Technology. And so universities have very little power to actually make change or to really do any action that they want individually. This is why most universities in Korea tend to be somewhat uniform. You kind of get a sense of there's not a lot of variation between different institutions. They kind of fall in the same model. But that's just the big picture. I want to focus in on kind of from start, from admissions, going all the way through to developing people. So looking up close at educating students. Because these are the future innovators that are going to be crucial for an economy. Who's coming out of universities? And to do that, we have to start with who's coming in and searching for talent. And so most of us probably are aware that Korea has a final exam in high school that kind of decides which school you're going to go to. It's called the Sunam, or in English, the college SAT, collegiate SAT. It's a big day. Here's a picture from 2004. Students cheering on test takers the day of. If you were here in November, you may have seen this if you passed by any high school. You may have also heard the silence that happened for several hours as all the jets are stopped, all police turn off their sirens. But I don't think a lot of people really get what the Sunam is. What's being tested here? And so here's how it works. There are three main sections that all students have to take. It's language, mathematics, and foreign language, which is only English. So I call it English. The middle column here is the top score. And how these scores work is actually very interesting. So in the SAT, it's basically more points, the more test questions you get right, the higher your score. You're not really competing against other people. It's not a relative test. It's a test of proficiency on the SAT in the United States. If you get a 2400, everyone can get 2400s, literally. They may rebalance the test in future years, but in 1 year, everyone can do it. That is not the case with the Sunam. The Sunam is based off of a mean. The middle score is given 100 points, and each standard deviation above that is worth 20 points. And so these scores actually change year to year. And on the right is the number of students who got the top score. And quite notably, this last year, English had a huge increase in the number of people who had 100%. You'll notice that in Korea, there's almost 2,000 students, but in English, there are 17,000 perfect scores. And so for those of you who are ETAs here in Korea, you're certainly a part of this push for working on English scores. And so last year, the highest score was about 616, just to get you a sense of the numbers. So one of the major points here is because it's a relative score, it's really an arms race. Because as everyone starts to work harder, you're actually not getting ahead. It's not an absolute score, it is a relative score. And so you see that there's really no end to hagwons, there's really no end to studying, because if you stop studying, others don't, your score literally goes down. It's not an attainment, it's a relative score against others. And this score is used to apply to college. So if you go to a top school in Seoul, like Yonsei or Korea, Seoul National University, you need a score around 530 to 540. So the highest score is 616, so you can kind of get a sense of what it looks like. Engineering tends to be lower in Seoul. So if you want to go to a university in Seoul, which a lot of students do, they want to leave their hometowns and go to Seoul, they tend to go into engineering. And one of the interesting things I've found with interviewing engineering students here, not at, say, Korea or any of the top universities, but sort of the next level down, many of the people there didn't want to do engineering and still don't. They're there because they want to be in Seoul. And they're doing engineering on the side. And that's problematic because the top students aren't going into engineering. And that's where the innovation starts. But the last thing, which is kind of interesting to me, you can only apply to 3 universities. There are rules based on which university classification you're in. You can apply to 1 university in each classification, so you cannot apply to Yonsei in Korea. You can apply to Seoul and Yonsei, Seoul in Korea, not Yonsei in Korea. There are rules, and you can pick 3. So there's a lot of kind of gamemanship going on here because no one wants to be left out of the university admissions. But finally, and this is what's getting really interesting, I think, at least for me, for the American side, and maybe just me, I thought this examination was kind of end-all be-all of all admissions here in Korea. But there is another way to get into a lot of universities called sushi admissions, a kind of special admissions process into college. And these days, tens of thousands of students are taking these special admissions. So if you come from the countryside, if you come from a fishery village, if you have special talents that are not otherwise represented on the SUNA, maybe art or maybe programming, you can actually avoid the test entirely. You can get in without taking the test. So it's not a monolithic exam. And this kind of leads to the unique institution of KAIST. KAIST admissions is unique in Korea. It is the only school that uses holistic admissions. It is built off the American admissions model. It uses essays, interviews. This year they changed it all up with 2 weeks to spare, so everyone had to kind of redo their applications at the last minute. We're fighting the window.
It's going to get hot.
And so it's quite different on the students it picks up. But it does lead to a couple of problems. And I want to identify 3 separate groups that have kind of a different point of view when going into KAIST. First, international students. If you were at the Jeju conference, I mentioned the 2.5% number. It's actually 5% these days. So big jump, doubled. But still, it's still 95% Korean. And so there's a lot of issue with trying to integrate international students into KAIST and kind of attract people from around the world. Today, 58% come from Asia. So most of the students at KAIST or international generally come from places like Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and all the other stans in the former Soviet Union. And these students oftentimes don't have access to high quality higher education, and so KAIST really represents something in the neighborhood, so to speak, that allows them to do it. In terms of North America, about 6% come from North America, mostly Korean American students, through a special process that KAIST has for Koreans who go to the United States and come back. The second group that has an interesting problem, Korean science high school students. The admissions rates are not published. They're all confidential, classified. I do have the rate from 2005 through some digging. I have the emails from the former president, all of them, everything he ever sent. And so there's a lot. He provided them, so it's okay. In 2005, the admissions rate was about 75%. So about 3 out of 4 students who applied from science high schools got into KAIST. These students are incredibly well prepared. They are ready to go from day one. In many cases, they've already taken the first and sometimes second year of KAIST undergraduate coursework before they start. And so these students do really, really well in classes. Unfortunately, this tends to push out people from quote-unquote normal high schools. They don't have as much preparation, particularly if they go to a foreign language high school. They may not have taken science at all. And in order to get your scholarship, you need to maintain a 3.0 or above, what's known as a B0 at KAIST. And a lot of the normal, kind of typical Korean high schools that are not specialized in science actually fail this and lose their scholarships at KAIST. Every quarter, 20% of students will go under because of the curve. There are curves in every class. And so there's a lot of pressure. This is where the suicide issue really comes from. It's sort of this academic pressure on students who didn't have the preparation going in and competing against students who did. And so I don't know where that kind of leads up, but these are the kind of 3 major groups in KAIST. I want to talk about creativity. So we talked about using tools within constraints to come up with solutions to problems. And KAIST tries to do that from day one through a program called the Freshman Design Program. You can see the poster fair here. The idea of this program is Korean high school students practice for the SUNA. It's not a creative enterprise. It's mostly memorization, it's mostly practice. And what KAIST wants to do is get these students out of that mold to build something from scratch, using whatever they knew from their high school and building something with their own two hands. They may build software. This is a location-based real-time help request application for the disabled on the left. So if you are in a wheelchair, get stuck somewhere and need someone to help, you go into an iPhone app and request assistance. The one on the right was kind of this ebook reader in which you could actually pull pages out, like as an attachment. There's also hardware. This is in response to the Japanese tsunami, a type of emergency shelter that we quickly erected in the event of an emergency. And what's amazing is these students have only been at KAIST for about 8 to 10 weeks when they make this stuff. And so what I think is really amazing about this program, and really signals, is that Korean students can be innovative when they're put in the environment to do so. That this notion that all Korean students aren't innovative, that they're not creative, is not true. Everyone is innovative every day. That's my message. The only message you should remember. And it's so true when you see these dozens, literally dozens of groups. Every single freshman student has to take this class. The amount of diversity, the amount of creativity they come up with in terms of products is amazing. In terms of just some issues with the program, students complain about lack of direction. So one of the things with teaching innovation is sometimes innovation just doesn't happen on the schedule you want it to happen. Sometimes you can't wake up and build something completely new that day. So understanding that innovation tends to happen in spurts and teaching kind of the culture of innovation still is a major point here. And second is kind of subjective grading. How do you grade innovation? Because ultimately that's what teachers have to do, and so there's some griping about that. But overall, the program has been very successful, and a lot of students kind of change their major after that. And that's what's really amazing about KAIST as well. It's a unique university in Korea that allows you to choose your major. You don't have to choose until the end of your sophomore year, the second year you're at KAIST. That's different from most schools in which you have to basically choose as part of the admissions process. So here's the only place where people get to choose and where they go. So there are 13 majors at KAIST. The largest is computer science with 412, and I know it's really small, but there's really no way to put 13 things on the slide. Some large ones, bio, civil engineering, industrial engineering. And one of the major questions I had was, well, what criteria did students use to choose their major? We kind of have a unique kind of system here. And we did a survey. I worked with an undergraduate, Jin Young, to survey about 250 undergraduates. And these are the things they mentioned the most in order. The number one thing is mentors, or kind of their seniors, if you're familiar with the Korean system. Their friends were civil engineers who were ahead of them a year or two. That's where they ended up. That was the number one concern, is staying with their friends' careers. Second, and kind of the other ones you can kind of think of as kind of more typical, I think, for America if you do this kind of research. Employment prospects, how hard is it going to be, do I get A's, and the prestige and status. At KAIST, the most difficult major is physics. That has the most difficulty prestige. But it's also one of the smallest majors, so take that what you will. But again, going on this notion of that students are creative, when you look at the extracurricular activities that students do, my favorite here is a group called Sparks. This is actually in the undergraduate library. All clubs, and I don't know if this is actually the same at other universities, but at KAIST, all clubs are allowed to use space. They have their own rooms in their own buildings. And so Sparks actually has the ground floor of the library. And this is their office space here. They each get a desk, every member of this kind of student club. And here's what's amazing about it. These students run the course management software for KAIST. Syllabus, test taking, quizzes, grades, they're the ones running the actual system behind it. They have held 334 seminars since 1993. And I got a list of all of them, kind of looked through them, and it's amazing how modern the technologies are. If you're familiar with online banking in Korea, you're aware that a lot of companies do not use quote-unquote modern technologies. They use technologies that first were introduced in 1998, like active server pages and ActiveX controls. And so what's interesting is that these students are actually jumping ahead. They're using the technologies that I use in Silicon Valley, that Google uses, things like Python, Java. And also what this club does is it keeps track of alumni. And so it was first introduced in 1988, and they admit about 12 students a year, so there's about 262 members in their alumni network, all across companies throughout the region. And what's really awesome about this is it started to create that first innovation network of talking to people, getting ideas, and getting a flow of innovation. And I really do believe that it's organizations like this, at Stanford, it's the Stanford ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, as where a lot of entrepreneurs come from who actually program things. It's really these student groups where the people first start to meet the people who they'd start companies with. But let's say if you're coming out of KAIST and you still didn't get it all done, and you didn't learn everything you wanted to, there are other ways of picking up the knowledge. In terms of creating these thinkers, a lot of corporations have programs. Here's two examples. That one did not come out at all. The Samsung Talent Program, the iPhone Developer University Program. I want to talk about one in particular, which is the Samsung Club. This is what it looks like. And you know it's modeled after Google because there are beanbag chairs. And they're multicolored too. They're not just one color. It's very important. But this is actually a club. This is in Samsung Dong. And what they do, this is a Samsung-run program of talent development. And what they do is they admit people, students, who are either in high school or college, to work at one of these 8 clubs scattered throughout Korea. There's one in Seoul. And the one we're going to talk about today is SGen Club, which has about 52 students, and 20 of them are from high school. So they're actually employed by Samsung in high school, which is pretty cool. And what they do is they work for Samsung for 2 years. They work on 4 projects of their choice. They're innovative. They can do any kind of entrepreneurship they want. And what they get is mentorship from VP level Samsung leadership, free laptop, the allowance you just saw, 10-month won a month, and a 95% guarantee that they will get a full-time offer at Samsung working at the club, which is a pretty altogether awesome deal for a job that no one actually checks whether you actually show up or not. And so what you're seeing here is kind of the basic ingredients of an ecosystem. We're seeing that students are creative. They're having programs that kind of unleash their creativity. We're seeing them form student groups that allow them to kind of build the first networks that will be at business. And that started to be the kind of, first movement in terms of the ecosystem, and particularly with startups. And that's what we're going to turn to next, is the actual ecosystem for starting companies here in Korea. So going from the students up one level. So I visited one of the major kind of events of the year for startups called Startup Weekend. It happened a couple weeks ago. Here's a picture of a presentation as people are signing up kind of crazily for different startups. There were about 150 participants and 38 startup ideas. And all those startups actually kind of came to fruition. So if you will, 38 companies were started that weekend during this kind of event. It's somewhat small. Similar ones in Silicon Valley may be 300 or 400, and they're weekly, sometimes multiple times a week. But I think this gives you a sense that there's a good start of a group of people getting this going. I want to give you 2 examples of what we're kind of talking about when we go to these kind of events. One was, men dress up because they want to look smart and get on women's side, and vice versa. So in this shopping mall, men can buy clothing recommended by women, and vice versa. So instead of getting recommendations from your friends, you get them from the other gender, because ultimately that's who you're hoping to attract. That was a pretty cute idea. And one that's kind of focused on South Korea, a service for hair designers and customers who are in need for advice. Customers will be able to find the right hair designers through our matching system, or be connected to the preferred designer and track which salon the designer is employed. So if you have that perfect ajumma haircut, you can make sure that you can keep finding that person as they travel all across Seoul. And so this is kind of where the first start is. This is where the first kind of, seed of a company begins. But to turn that seed into a full company, you have to create, you have to scale. And scaling requires capital, money. And so what does venture capital look like in South Korea? Right now, there are 116 venture capital firms. They manage 419 funds. Venture capital funds generally last about 10 years each. It's a standard rate. So this is about 40 a year, if you will. And they're doing about 10 trillion won. And you can there's a math later on which I convert that to dollars, which took like 20 minutes. But here's a sense of what venture capital flow is looking like. So you'll notice that the number of funds have been cyclical since in the last decade. But what's interesting is the amount of money invested in Korea has increased and has actually begun to grow faster exponentially here in the last 3 years. What's really interesting, if you look at where the financial crisis happened, you'll notice that it was pretty flat line going into the financial crisis. But as other investments sort of dried up, money has been moved to new growth industries faster and faster as people are discovering that the investment is good. And so that's a really interesting look at venture capital. But another way to look at it is, where is the money going? So all this new money is kind of coming in, but what kind of industries are being targeted? I find this, like, I think, the most interesting graph in this entire presentation. If you look at 2002, IT, information technology, is by far the #1 target of venture capital dollars. They had 400 companies invest that year. And as you see, it has just continually kind of gone down over the years. And what's replaced it is this culture and content notion of kind of more what you would think of in terms of Silicon Valley, these kind of Instagram, social networks kind of companies. And so this kind of information technology, which tends to be more hardware-based, when Korea talks about information technology, it tends to be hardware-based. You see that it's really transitioning to more software. And that's really, really important, because software is where it scales. Software is where the big money comes from. It's where you can get 20, 30, 40% growth in a year. And so the money is definitely changing its trajectory and where it's going. The last one is also really interesting, where the capital is in terms of developing the company. And when you're developing a company, there's kind of 3 stages. There's the early stage, we have maybe less than 30 employees, not that much revenues, mostly probably almost guaranteed a profit loss. You're investing a lot of money in growth. And then there's the expansion stage, when you're trying to grow from 30 employees to 1,000 employees. And there's later stage, which is basically trying to get into market, to go public. And you'll notice that where the money is going has changed. Early stage has gone down, and there's been a major focus on later stage. In fact, all the money is going later in these companies. And it's difficult to really kind of untangle that. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? But that's one of the trends, is that the money is going later, which is, in my mind, a more guaranteed investment. It's much easier to predict a later stage company than it is to predict a company that only has 5 employees. So it looks like venture capital seems to be kind of mitigating its risk. Just to give you a little quick kind of comparison, last year, this is 2011 data, there were 181 funds started in the United States. There were 67 started in Korea. About 2 billion in Korea, 19 billion in the United States. And given the size of the economy, Korea's economy is about $1 trillion. The United States is about 14, 15 trillion. This is actually not, it's not out of proportion. It's doing really well. This is not where it's really lacking, I think. It's in venture capital. And there have been success stories. Not many, but there is a really famous one for some of you who may have heard of Ticket Monster, or Timon, as it's sometimes abbreviated here. You know it's serious because they have a mascot that walks around on the sidewalk. But this company basically was the local deals company for Korea. If you're familiar with Groupon, it was the Groupon of Korea, so to speak, with a little kind of Korean twist. And they were founded in 2010, and last year sold for $350 million. About 16 months total time. Had 600 employees when it was all done. So it is definitely possible to start companies here and sell them and do well. But, and there is always a but, there are a lot of problems in the ecosystem. I did notice the one example, and it's sort of the one. There are not hundreds, but what are some of the ecosystem problems we should look at? It's difficult to start companies in Korea. I'm not sure if this is still true, but up to about 4 years ago, Korea still required several $1,000s down payment on actually getting a corporate charter, corporate license. So it's really hard to just start. I'm considering starting a company in a couple weeks here, and a typical amount you're given is about $18,000. And in Korea, that would be basically the down payment to the government in order to start the company. There's no actual investment in the company itself. So just clearing out how to start companies and allowing them to happen faster is major. The second is what I call a first mover problem, but someone has to actually start companies first. And there's not a lot of incentive for any individual to do so. They may be working at Samsung, have a very stable career with a lot of benefits, there's just not a lot of incentive for them to go out and leave that behind, particularly when 96, 97% of startups fail. It's basically a guarantee that you will fail and maybe you get lucky and you win. And so most people are not going to leave first, which also means there are no mentors to help people start companies. Third, and this is extremely important, exit opportunities. How do you actually make money? You start a company, it may be from revenue, but in many cases they're sold to someone. They may go public or may go sold to Facebook because they have a lot of money, or Google. In Korea, there's not a lot of companies to sell. Samsung will not buy, in many cases, startup companies. They don't want to bring people who are not made in the Samsung man or woman model, who did not go through their 6-week kind of orientation. They won't necessarily hire them. That's true across all of the major kind of conglomerates. And kind of like I said here, and kind of overall, it's just a very difficult career path. And so when we talk about the future of startups, of innovation, of building this kind of region, of creating so-called the next Steve Jobs of Korea, I think the key point is to start with what you have. I think Korean policymakers, as policymakers everywhere do, they look to, say, Silicon Valley, or they look to a certain example and say, I want to copy that. And they look at the characteristics of Silicon Valley small firms and diversity, and they say, that's what we need to make that happen. And that's the wrong approach. As I mentioned earlier, Silicon Valley is an accident of history. Many things happened together that kind of built it up. And so we need to start with what you have. And one of the major things we have here, some of the conclusions here, the Chamber are really crucial to this whole agenda. They hold the key to innovation here. There's no way to get rid of them, maybe in the long run, but they're not going anywhere today. They're huge. And as I mentioned with Google and a lot of the major firms in Silicon Valley, including Microsoft, Facebook, they're very open and progressive. They don't mind employees leaving, coming out. That is very different at these large conglomerates, where people leaving is considered a traitor. They're never talked to again. They will not buy their companies. They'll try to destroy them. They'll copy them to discourage other people from doing that. And that's the kind of cultural change that I think is also doable, but has to happen. You may not be able to convince people to change their approach. You can certainly start talking about the benefits, that there's actually large-scale community benefits from doing this, that you actually become more profitable the more open you are. This has been proven again and again in the Silicon Valley context. Second, and this is a little critical, higher education is a mess in Korea. And I think a lot of people know this. The Korean government says this is its #1 priority. I think the Korean government also, because it's its #1 priority, gives it the most focus, which means the most number of people have a piece in the pie. There are 2 ministries that run higher education in this country. There's the Ministry of Education, Science, Technology, and the Ministry of the Knowledge Economy. And they kind of fight over what their priorities are. And then at KAIST, there's sort of different factions in the faculty that fight, and the president fights everyone. And that's why the last president was forced out. The current president's going to be forced out, and there's no one who wants to be president next time, so it's kind of unclear who's going to run the university. Figuring this out is the #1 priority. If you are building talent, and I'm an elitist in talent, the innovation comes from the absolute top people, every time. You have to get the top people. And right now they're going to the United States, and they're going elsewhere, and they don't come back. And so Korea wants to build this kind of innovation pipeline. It wants to start this innovation ecosystem. It has to get those top people to stay, and it has to do so by actually creating higher education institutions that are awesome, that are great. But I want to leave, not on so much of a low note, this is my last slide. Korean culture is ready. It's ready for it to happen. I do not believe that entrepreneurship does not exist in this country. I have walked through Namdaemun, Shitong, I've walked through the markets here. I have never seen more entrepreneurs in per capita in one place in my entire life. And really that ethos of moving fast, of finding opportunities and seeking them out is what innovation is all about. It's about building up value. It's about using creativity, using your tools to solve problems. And I think it can absolutely happen. It can be unlocked. It is happening. And I think the Korean culture is ready. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Are there any questions? Thank you. Real quick, it is 8 o'clock right now. I was told that the time limit for this presentation was 8. We're going to take a few questions, but I will be here throughout the dinner to answer anyone's questions, so feel free to come up, but I don't want to hold off everyone's dinner and empty stomachs and everything. So we'll do 3 or 4 questions. Yes?
What credence, after all, do you give to those 4 good, 4 not so bad theories.
Sure. I hate to do this, but it's an all of above E kind of answer. I think money is important. No money means no innovation. I mean, it's as simple as that. But at a certain point, it's not about cash. It's about the people who are showing up. I focus on labor economics. I focus on talent. It's the people who are there. And what's crucial is creating an environment that those people want to be in. And in Silicon Valley, like I mentioned, we have this environment. I swear it's the most overlooked fact of Silicon Valley's success. It is great weather. The mountains are nearby. You can go skiing 2 hours away. You can be in LA in 5 hours. You can be on a desert. It is able to attract the best people, and that is what is most important. And everything else comes from that.
Yeah, I think one of the underlying kind of assumptions of your research is that Korea is that we want innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Is it innovation? Is it something that we're trying? That's an objective. That's a goal. And I think your data supports kind of a historical narrative that in Korea that for the last 60 years is that Korea has not, that innovation has not been the primary goal, but that with this psychology of late industrialization, that Korea is a very new country, new onto the scene. There's 56 years onto the scene, late compared to the major imperial powers, and that their goal, and this is supported by all of your data too, right? The centralization of the education system, the cooperation between the table and the government, and all this. The goal was never, at least with the nation building project, to promote innovation. The goal was to catch up. And so I think that the questions that I'm interested in are not so much why hasn't innovation happened. I think the questions are who in Korea wants innovation? Innovation as opposed to imitation and catching up. Right? And where, in what niches do you find innovation in spite of the centralized and the kind of the militarization of Korean society? And then lastly, to what extent the culture and all these factors that you mentioned, as well as economy of scale and historical advantage, to what extent do these motivate not who can innovate, but who wants to innovate?
I'll answer all of the above. So I had a large sequence of slides. You can tell I had 141 slides, so some stuff kind of got cut. One of the pieces I really like to do as a thought exercise is difference of growth rates. If you compare countries that grow at 4% versus 6%, in 20-25 years, it's a 30 to 40, 50% difference in the income of those two countries. Who wants innovation? You could say society, but it's the government. And specifically, they're looking for a new source of growth. As I mentioned, Silicon Valley is a high-growth region. That's what it does. It does high-growth stuff. And right now, if you look at the economic growth rates, it used to be 8-9% a year throughout the catch-up period. And now it's gotten lower and lower. It's about 4% in the last few years. And the Korean policymakers really do believe it's going towards zero. They won't say that too publicly, but there's not a real sign that it can continue to innovate. Korea has traditionally increased its work hours and not its productivity to make that happen. And there's just so much time in the day to be able to do that. And so there has always been an emphasis on this kind of innovation. So government policymakers are trying to get universities like KAIST to change from what they called winning markets to winning Nobels, is how they kind of trademark slogan it. But where I think the innovation really comes from is young people. People at SGen Club, people who are not willing to work at Samsung, don't want to become Samsung men and women, who are kind of, you might say, use the term rebel, but kind of sort of countercultural, except in Korea that doesn't mean a whole lot. But they're people who don't want to follow the trend. And I have met a lot of these people. They do exist, and that's where the innovation is going to come from, because they're going to do things differently. And there's just so much, one of the reasons why I'm here, there's so much low-hanging fruit. Because there's so little innovation being done right now, that the first people who do it, there is so much to be done. There's just so much you can do right now to make things better. And so that's where it's going to come from. It's going to come from young people.
Korea is a rather small market, and the reason that Facebook was able to pay $1 bajillion for Instagram was because it could move globally. It moved globally very quickly, and the U.S. government was able to protect the intellectual property. As we're moving from physical property to intellectual property, you need to have a government that's going to protect that. And so at the extreme, we have all these these recent bills coming up in Congress where they can just turn off the tap for the internet for other countries to prevent that software from being hacked or ripped off or stolen outright. But is the South Korean government, if they're going to create these opportunities for startups in Korea to expand beyond the 48 million, and then develop the capital resources from that expansion, are they prepared to make entrances into new markets as a government legally to defend these new IP concerns?
Yes. There is a huge difference between what the Korean government says and what it actually does. When it comes to copyright enforcement, they talk a lot about copyright enforcement, but you can download a lot of stuff. Here in Korea, you can steal intellectual property. I will say intellectual property is more protected for Korean firms than it is for foreign firms in Korea. So there is a little bit of a different kind of approach the government takes. The government is not prepared. And there are a couple of, Koreans speak Korean, unlike the United States, which speaks English, so there's sort of an instant way, like Facebook spread to England. Cambridge was its third and fourth school, Oxford and Cambridge after Harvard and Stanford. And so one of the interesting things about here, it's how do you expand to foreign markets easily? I think where the source is going to come is Koreans who are overseas, to a certain degree, have to come back. You have to attract these people to come back, because they're the ones who are going to have the local knowledge and make that successful. But there is actually a lot there. This question is really interesting in China. The Chinese software market is almost non-existent. And most people, including me, believe that comes from intellectual property. You cannot build something if there's no investment. You cannot get money back because people can steal right away. And I do agree that I think greater intellectual property protections are important.
I really enjoyed your presentation, partly because I'm a co-founder of an IT startup company about a year and a half ago, so hearing your presentation is kind of interesting from the other side. One thing that kind of was curious to me was what your conclusion that the chaebol need to do something to create this ecosystem, and they need to do something, they're kind of the answer. But one of the feeling among a lot of people in venture companies and small who are doing startups are like kind of the chaebol the enemy, if anything. And so one of the examples you gave of innovation was this S-Gen Club, which is Samsung's thing. And from my perspective, it almost seems like that's Samsung sucking out the innovation so that they can use it for their own purposes. And so I'm really curious to know if you have any kind of specific suggestions from your perspective, what the chaebol, I mean, classifying as the chaebol is kind of whatever, but KT or SKT or any of these really big companies, what kind of things do you think they can do specifically other than just being open, right? Like that. Right.
I think one of the problems is today it's predatory. These companies actively try to prevent these companies from forming. They do try to steal workers, if you will. They're kind of sore losers almost, if you will. Like they actively try to discourage this from happening. And you'll notice one of the interesting things, talking to a lot of software engineers, is they will wait a long time to work at Samsung. They'll wait 5-6 years out of undergrad. They'll practice for tests. They'll practice their English. They'll run in the Imagine Cup to try to get noticed. If they do well in these kind of programming competitions, they'll get noticed and hired and recruited. And so, one of the problems is kind of the labor flexibility. It's the kind of rigor in the labor market. It's not very flexible. People work, they tend to stay for 40 years. It's not the kind of flow. In Silicon Valley, people work at one company about 18 months on average. That's across the software industry. Here, they tend to stay forever. And I think when I say about openness, there's a lot of different underlying factors. It's being flexible of bringing in new talent and allowing talent to leave. It's about ideas, about realizing that ideas aren't necessarily the most valuable part. It's how you use them. And it's about execution. And allowing that everything doesn't have to be vertically and horizontally integrated. So every part doesn't have to be made from a Samsung subsidiary. That it can go out, that it can contract, that it can start to create a flow. And so when I say that the chaebol are crucial, I don't mean literally they will be the ones who start small companies. What I'm saying is they have to change to allow that to happen. They're kind of blocking it from happening.